Yeah, I grew up in moving around a lot as a kid, always seeming to come back to the area around Santa Barbara, um, but definitely grew up pretty modest means, um, from a family where my mother's side were what you would call charismatics, what most people would call the evangelicals, but it's a little bit different. And my father was a Maoist when I grew up, so did not believe in God at all. And so I was exposed to very different versions of reality. And I also was exposed very early to science. And I was a just perennial skeptic. I would spend many hours showing my grandfather or my mother or my aunt why such and such thing in the Bible was impossible, right? Because of archaeological evidence, because of evolutionary theory, or because of a variety of other things. And so I spent, I guess, from age 5 to age 17, mostly trying to criticize faith and belief, and things that nowadays I would really value and prize. But I was, because my mother's side of the family took faith at too literal or face value, and I would argue at a very surface level instead of a deep faith, that I was preoccupied with the literalism and fighting whatever that literal interpretation was, without really being old enough to see that there might be a deeper meaning.
So you had a charismatic evangelical mother and a Maoist father and a skeptical mind growing up. So how did you not get in huge fights with your parents, or did you?
Oh, I did. I mean, I would, even when I was barely in grade school, I would read scientific journals and, things that made it really easy to come up with evidence against things that I found in the Bible. So, and I was, because a really great teacher, it was actually my mom, because my mom introduced me to the Lord of the Rings when I was first grade. I became a really good reader.
Mm-hmm.
And I just sort of abused that leap start, you could say. And so I was reading the Old Testament and reading scientific journals when I was in grade school, and probably before maybe I had the maturity and understanding about the way life really works to really see that there might be a meaning to the Bible that's deeper and maybe less literal than people, all too often, I guess, are drawn to. People, I think, are often drawn to literal truths because it's sort of given in a package. Right? That's kind of easy. And I think deep faith, no matter what tradition you find that in, requires some commitment of thought, maybe it's commitment of time, but more of a commitment of either time or thought or life to come to some understandings.
Before I delve into the details, kind of a big picture question, how important would you say faith is and has been in your life?
I think it's of vital importance to me. I think that without it, I would have been drawn to very cold aspects of of my ideology. I mean, I think growing up, I was already environmentalist, but I was a very, I was a real misanthrope because of my environmentalism. I really didn't love humanity. In fact, I probably hated it. And I think that without an understanding of God, and without an understanding of God, I don't think I could have really understood people. And I think that's really important. I think our society tries to move so fast. T.S. Eliot, in his poem Choruses from the Rock, his first question is sort of, where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge, and where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Where is the life we have lost in living? And I think that's a really important question for the information age.
And so you began your kind of thinking career as a child, being very skeptical, challenging your mother's faith, and probably challenging your father's ideas also, I'm sure. And I know, well, rather than labeling you, where did that transformation happen? So you went from age 5 to 17 being very skeptical, and then you changed around that time frame, it sounds like, to kind of seeing the deeper truths in Christianity and other views perhaps also.
I think I had what some people would call, a moment of clarity or understanding. I grew up surfing, and I think one morning I was out at Halama, and it was pretty big, and a pot of dolphins came through, and I kind of left the waves to go farther out to see the dolphins, and I think I turned back at the cliffs towering over the sea, and I saw something, I felt something. For a moment, and though I didn't really attach it to any one faith, for a moment, a skeptic, had absolute clarity that there was architecture in the universe, that there were like bones and scaffolding behind what we see, design and certainty that there was so much design that there was a designer, and that really changed my openness to things about faith and made me much more voracious in my desire to learn more. I had always read, the Bible or other religious texts more out of curiosity of how to lampoon it, and then after that I started to read it out of a desire to understand it.
So your experience surfing at Halama, well, has that intuition, that feeling stayed with you in the same way that it did then? Or was that kind of the first kind of light or kind of portal into a deeper reality?
I think moments like that, moments of great clarity, moments of maybe a deeper understanding about life and God, or even about someone that you love, they are moments that are easy to lose in how fast life moves. It's easy to question it later and go, did I just imagine that, right? But I've also felt subsequent moments like that has helped that stay real in me. And I also, I think by writing it down and by, thinking about it, I've tried to hold on to that. And I would say that while the natural tendency would be for something like that to fade, it's only grown stronger in me in the last 20 years.
And in terms of Christianity, as you mentioned a minute ago, your experience surfing in Halama certainly, I think, would match the experience and intuition of most any mystical faith. And for you, it sounds like you delved more into Christianity at that point from that experience. Was that because this is the cultural milieu we live in, or did you feel a particular resonance toward Christianity from that and other experiences?
I think there's no doubt that if I had grown up in a Muslim country, that I would have taken that experience and gone through the sort of Muslim lens of God to get there. I have no doubt that if I grew up in Tel Aviv, that I would have taken that experience and brought it through the Judaistic lens. But I also think that there is something powerful that I've found in that. And I wouldn't necessarily say that I would have ended up in any different place. I guess that what I'm saying is that I may have started through one of those other lenses, but I think the road would just have been a different road to get to the same place. Rumi, the Sufi Muslim poet, said, "There are many paths to the one," and I fundamentally think that's true. I believe in more accountability than to think that it's just sort of like any way to get there is okay. I don't necessarily believe that, or I don't believe that, but I do think there are many paths to find God. And my path was through finding it through the church, and sometimes despite the church, and through a process of understanding and reading and learning about a faith that had the same words written than my mother's family believed in, but finding a deeper meaning in those words. And I think I feel blessed that I guess the world's great faiths exist, and I think that it would be really difficult and hard to find God without them, but it's very sad to me that sometimes people have a hard time finding God because of them. I think there's sometimes people's perception of faith or the projection of what a religion is made by some of its adherents is more of a stumbling block for people to find faith in God than anything else. And so I think what's that quote? Save me, O God, from the zeal of your believers. Right?
I've never heard that. I like that. That's good.
Because my thought is that if people have found God and have found a connection with that infinite, unknowable nature of God, that they would not try to make it harder for other people to find God.
Yeah, I have the same intuition for sure. Now, I just want to add as a disclaimer here, I want to ask you some more penetrating questions about Christianity. I
Sure.
understand, of course, that given your position, you might not want to be totally public on this stuff. So anything that you say, well, first of all, feel free to say, I don't want to answer that.
Sure.
Second, you are entirely welcome to say, I don't want that to be aired
Right.
in your movie, whatever you say here. So
Okay.
just feel free, to speak your mind. So with Christianity, one problem that people often have, including myself, is that you can read parts of the Bible and they're frankly horrific. Leviticus, thou shalt be put to death for adultery.
Right.
That's what put to death for homosexuality. You cannot wear fabrics of mixed, or clothing of mixed fabrics.
Right.
It's clearly outdated ideas from the modern perspective. How does one get past that if you are interested in Christianity?
I think that you have to come to the conclusion that either there is an evolutionary development of what God expects of people, or that people's understanding of God evolves. I mean, I've read the Bible many times, and it becomes obvious that if you read it linearly, that the God that's written about in Genesis is much more capricious. The God that's written about early in the Old Testament looks more like what polytheistic gods look like. And the God that the prophets write about all of a sudden is a God of justice, of something bigger than its own agenda, a God that treasures the poor, that treasures the oppressed, and that by the time you get into the New Testament, you have a God that is about love and about sacrifice. And I don't think that God changed. I think people changed. And I think that our search for God is not just an individual's process, but it is a culture and a race's process. And that human beings have emerged from a very bloody and horrible childhood into a very dangerous adolescence, and hopefully we will grow up. But I am maybe a utopian in the sense that I do believe that people can grow up, that the human race that's I would characterize as a child race can grow up. But I also believe that finding God is fundamentally a part of that process of growing up. I would say, for instance, the example of various brutal forms of totalitarian utopianism is the primary example of what happens when you try to build a utopia without God, and when you try to transcend human selfishness without God. And I think that with an understanding of God comes the ability to unlock something different in the human spirit.
So with Christianity and the Bible more generally, how would you distill your kind of take home from that tradition? What's most important to you, and what do you think is kind of the underlying truth that goes beyond the literal words?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you that I am one of these people that believes that everyone can find God, and that that you don't have to follow a formula to find God. Like there are certain Christian cults that, they even have a conversion formula. I learned about one in college by being recruited, right? And they actually have a formula for converting you. I believe that each person's path can and often is different. But I think the danger in modern spirituality, where you can learn from so many different sources, is the tendency to want to create a sort of, choose your own adventure form of faith, where I'm just going to take this from here and this from there and this from there and make up this and this and this. But this part over here that I don't really like, I'm just going to ignore it. So I really tried to think about, okay, there's some things here that are repulsive to me. What of those things that are repulsive? And then there's some things here that are that ring with such a truth that I find it hard to even shut it out. What of the things that are repulsive to me are repulsive because I just don't want to face it? And what of those things are repulsive because maybe there's something that is not important anymore? I mean, so I'll give you just for example. The Apostle Paul and Jesus collectively in their teachings sort of wiped away a lot of what you'd call the mitzvot in Leviticus, the laws of purity that people could have very serious consequences for, including being stoned to death and other things. And they sort of swept those things away. And just as we do not, force someone out of the community for eating pork or shellfish, which is also scripture in Leviticus, I don't think that you can take all of the punishments and prohibitions in Leviticus as gospel truth anymore, because essentially the people that I think some faiths would call prophets, and of course Christianity uses Jesus as something more like a shard of God put on earth. So those things, those people have swept those things away. And I think there's a pretty solid theological argument for that. Other things, I think you still wrestle with. And I think when I was younger, I think I wanted to believe that some of the harsh realities that I would characterize in Christianity exist in Christian theology weren't necessary to build a better world or to find God. I think when I was younger, I wanted to believe that you could get somewhere without maybe the level of sacrifice that I think is at the base of what Christianity is all about. And it wasn't until I could live longer and know that most beautiful things in life come through pain that I realized, wow, that's what it said the whole time, and I just didn't want to believe it, right? So I think we are very blessed to live in an age where we can believe what we want to believe, and where we can search multiple different paths, and the amount of knowledge and our potential to find the fullness of what Jewish rabbis called Ein Sof, without end. This is what one of their names of God, Ein Sof, without end. We have more of a potential than ever to understand more of a breadth of that. But we have to watch out for the pitfalls of going, I'm only going to look at the stuff that I like. Because I don't think that challenges our spirituality in the way where if we really try to look at all of it.
Yeah, there's definitely two big threads there I want to pursue. Let me start with the first one, which is certainly a long conversation in itself. Let me start. So you mentioned Ein Sof and the absolute, God as the ground, and there is a similar notion of God as summit. And so the way I think of this is that God as ground is unconscious, pure being. God as summit is perhaps a conscious being, the envelope of reality, source and summit. Brahman, Ein Sof, the absolute, ether, Akasha.
Right.
Do you personally agree with that kind of framing? Do you see that envelope? Have you experienced God as a personal God, or more as God as an impersonal, pure being?
I feel like I've experienced both, and I think it's pretty consistent with if you take a less than purely literal interpretation of the world's great faiths. So I feel like it's both something that I've experienced and is consistent if you're willing to even take something mostly literally, but not purely literally, about the teachings concerning the nature of God. And it's interesting that you think of it as ground and summit, because I think of it as sort of like in the metaphor of the sun. You know, even though that's a kind of pagan animistic totem, I think it has a real, there's a reason why even when humanity had very little understanding of God, it immediately went to it, because it's the life giver, right? And I think a metaphor through that is kind of a powerful metaphor. You know, I think like when you think of something, whether it's God the Father, what in Christianity you'd call God the Father, or in Judaism you'd call Ein Sof, that vast, unknowable God it's like the sun, right? And if you even look at it for an instant, it blinds you, you know. If we got close to it, it would burn you. And yet, it's the source of all life. And it's always there. And I would say that the idea of the personal God is more the idea that that sun shoots rays on a constant basis, that touches us, that performs photosynthesis, that is activities in this world. And that I think that there both exist, that there is a God that is unknowable, but there are activities of God, shards of God, that affect us all the time and that we have the ability to interact with.
Now there's a Trinity in Christianity, and we can reframe that in, for example, Hinduism as Brahman, the Father, the Holy Ghost as being essentially what they call Nirguna Brahman, which is kind of one level up, where it's kind of beginning to take form. And then, of course, you could look, say, Krishna, or
That's Jesus, right?
the Son. I'm not trying to say this is how it is. I'm saying It's an interesting parallel, and you can do this in many different ways. Do you? Well, let me reframe this. So there's a difference, of course, though. So you can create that kind of parallel structure. But a key difference that I've found with Christianity and some Eastern faiths and philosophies is that in Christianity, what I've seen, what I've read, what I've heard, it's not that we are identical with Brahman, the ground. And that is the case in Hinduism, is that we are that ground. We are God in a very real way, not just as a metaphor. We are the all. Tatvamasi. Does that resonate with you as a truth, or do you feel like the Christian framing is more helpful or resonant, or any other comment you care to make on that?
I just would not. I think there is. I just only think that there is a danger if you don't look at such knowledge with a degree of restraint, right? That you, and I would characterize that for all faiths, because there is a great danger in people believing that they are God, right? I mean, I would say precisely the thing that's wrong with the human race is the emerging belief that everybody has that I am the most important thing. And all you have to do is walk around and talk to people, or even more telling, listen to people who don't think that you're listening, to tell that that is more pronounced of a belief than any time in recent human history, where every person thinks they're the most important thing. And I would say that there's nothing that is more dangerous. That's, to me, the source of our environmental problems, and the source of the materialism that, if it goes unchecked, will destroy our race, and a whole lot of other races along the way. And so I think that there's something to be learned from the idea that we are not separate from creation, that we are not separate from God. I don't think there is anything in Christianity that denies that there is a separation inherent from God, though it's a part of the belief that you can do dumb stuff to separate yourself from God. But if you take oneness with God too literally, I think you overstate your own importance in the universe. And there's nothing more dangerous for our culture right now than overstating your own importance in the universe.
Sorry, one sec. Well, I totally agree with you, of course, on the environmental issues, and need to always be humble and recognize that we are part of a much larger process, and we need to, remedy a lot of things going on right now. And I would add only, as just in the spirit of discussion, when I say things like, in the Hindu tradition, the belief is literally that, one is God. It's not to self-aggrandize, it's to recognize that it's all one process, and that you are that process.
Right.
And you are, in a lame metaphor, so apt, you are a wave on that ocean, even though that wave has some distinction, some distinct entity. The far larger reality and identity of that little wave is the ocean itself.
Right.
And so I think you're right. You've got to keep in mind, it's not about being I am so important. It's about kind of recognizing that totality. But going back to the Christian ethic,
and I would even say that it is not a very dangerous tendency in other cultures, right? I mean, other cultures that know more about Hinduism, right, and more about that truth. I just think it's uniquely dangerous in Western culture. And so I think when people come from a Western culture and then learn about Hinduism, they really have to commit themselves to learn at a deep level, because otherwise they'll walk away with things that may be the wrong tendency, or what I think a deep spiritual teacher in that tradition might think is the wrong tendency.
yeah,
And I might agree with them. The interaction with Western culture has produced some weird aberrations in Christianity too, that I think is really important to surgically remove from the actual core of the faith to really understand it, right? That and what I guess I mean by Western civilization, sort of Germanic derived civilization, that most of Europe fell under the sway in the post-Roman period, and a lot of weird ideas come along with that. I think the God that's talked about in the Bible, the God of the Transfiguration, that is a much more ethereal entity than maybe the God that people think about or learn about in Sunday school. And I think the anthropomorphism of Western Christianity is not a product of the faith, but a product of Germanic culture. The idea of the war god, right? The god that we're going to take into battle with a big cross on it. That's something very much more reminiscent of Odin and Thor and these Germanic gods than I think it is of the core of the faith. And so just as I would say that there's some elements of Western culture that's dangerous to take some other faiths and mix it with, I'd say, that was one of the biggest problems in the first place, is that here a very bloody and warlike culture was melded onto a religion that all about love and sacrifice, and it's produced some weird results. And I would hope that to really find true Christianity, or to find a true path to God, even if you don't call it Christianity, that you can learn from those things even as you're discerning enough of what is a core part of the faith and what is something that our culture has grafted onto it.
Yeah, that's tricky for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, speaking of which, there's a lengthy debate about what Christ really said, of course, and there's a number of gospels not in the Bible,
Right,
known as the Gnostic Gospels or other gospels. And there was a long, discussion in the Christian movement about what should go in the Bible, and of course the Synoptic Gospels are what's in the Bible, plus I guess John, which is not synoptic, I believe. So, question for you is, you have Gospels like the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, which are later found Gospels, which present a fairly different depiction of Jesus. And have you followed this debate at all? Do you subscribe to the synoptic Christ, or do you see a broader view of Christ in other Gospels?
Well, I also think that it's not as black and white. There's a lot of writings, whether you call them some of them Gospels, some of them epistles, that were not included in what we think of as the New Testament. A lot of them weren't included not necessarily because they were rejected, but for brevity, for a little bit less certainty on the verification of the source. So the debate that produced what we think of as the New Testament was both a theological but also intellectual debate, right? So a lot of the writings where the authorship was more known, the authorship was closer to the time of Christ, those writings were tended to be included. Of course, also writings that corresponded more towards their orthodoxy also were included. And so, while I think that it is possible for writings to be apocryphal and still be divinely inspired, and I think most of the fathers, and of course at the very beginning there were mothers too, of the early church accepted many writings that are now viewed as apocryphal and viewed them as being important things, even though they were not included in the canon that we would call the New Testament. That being said, some of the ones that people that are maybe most unlike the Synoptic Gospels are also some of the ones that were written later and maybe less from a theological and more from an intellectual standpoint are less verifiable as having traced to one of the original apostles or to Christ's actual words. But if you read the Gospel of Thomas, you'll find a lot of parallels to the Synoptic Gospels too. You'll just read some other stuff that sounds a little bit more, maybe from our standpoint, Eastern, more open. So I would not deny the divine inspiration of the Gospel of Thomas. I just can't verify it either, right? But I do think that the Synoptic Gospels at least got it mostly right. I think that they're divinely inspired. I think that the people who wrote them down tried to do so faithfully. Do I think that means that everything was done perfectly when a fallible human being tries to transcribe everything faithfully? I don't know. And that's why I tend to look at the ones that were closer to the source. So the Gospel of Mark is the earliest, the source being closest in time and proximity to Jesus. And I would say I put more stock in that which is written in the Gospel of Mark than anything else, just because of that. I guess it's the scientist in me that makes me think, okay, this is the one that's least likely to be skewed from, Jesus's actual message. I also think that there's some power in where they're all consistent, which is most of the places, right? So some of the writings are not in order, and a lot of people would argue that they're not supposed to be in order. And some of the stories are a little bit different. Some of the stories sound like there was some detail added later, and or some detail omitted in the first, one or the other. I think it's probably easier to surmise that some of the detail might have been added later in some of the later Gospels. And then, of course, John's Gospel, I think if you look at John's writings as a real mystic, not all of his stuff is even meant to be taken literally, right? John wrote Revelation, and I think it does not take a deep knowledge of either history or of faith to realize that John talks in metaphor all the time in Revelation. And I don't necessarily believe that means that he wouldn't talk in metaphor when trying to describe the great and important experiences that Jesus went through either. So I would just say that John inherently wasn't a literalist, right? So it's harder to criticize that gospel, because to me when you're reading John, it's about the message, not necessarily about which chair was where in the room.
Yeah. You raised an interesting idea a minute ago that you have some gospels or other, apocryphal documents that are part of the canon, but not part of the public canon.
Right.
Where they made more advanced documents for those who are more interested in, learning more. But you also have, of course, a long tradition in the Christian faith of denouncing documents that are not considered to be part of the canon
right.
at all. So what we know, in fact, of the Gnostic Gospels was primarily, for a long time, what was written by Irenaeus in a 5-volume
right.
book called Against All Heresies.
Right.
And there's a lot of those gospels in there he denounces, very, vehemently. So I guess the question for you is how, if you are a seeker and curious about Christianity, either from the point of view of faith or of historiography or what have you, philosophy, how does one distinguish between what are kind of legitimate, apocryphal gospels and those that are, I guess, simply not, or that are, not meant to be part of the canon at all?
I guess how I would do it is I'd be looking at where the consistencies are and where things maybe explain one more instead of the points where they're diametrically opposed, right? So, to me, the idea that there are hidden truths that take spiritual understanding to unlock, that idea is pretty self-apparent to me, right? And so I'm not inherently offended by Gnosticism, right? There's elements of that I think is important to learn from. In fact, there's just as good of an argument that Christianity is partially informed, that Gnosticism reflects a tendency in Christianity that keeps on coming back, right? As an example, with what the Albigensian Crusade was against the Catharists, which I find even more in common with the Catharists of southern France that did things like administer communion themselves instead of relying on church authorities, came up with Bible studies, started redistributing wealth on a limited basis, and doing all these other things, that we would nowadays go, that sounds pretty good, right? And then, of course, at the time was considered such a threat to the status quo of power that they had to be eradicated like they were infidels, right? So, I mean, I think there is a tendency that keeps on coming back because it never completely dies within the church, right? Within the whole body of Christianity. Similarly, you could say there's a tendency from St. Augustine on of a different tendency, and I don't think it's all bad stuff. I think Irenaeus and St. Augustine had some legitimate criticisms of Gnosticism, including saying that that it led to such a revulsion with the human body that it was maybe the opposite of what you would characterize as the more Eastern belief that we are one with God, that we are a part and connected with God, and therefore everything about us is inherently, if we don't poison it, holy. And so there's some criticisms that I would say are legitimate criticisms, but I think people should learn from the apocryphal writings because they are definitely written by people who thought they were Christians. Maybe other people didn't think they were, but they thought they were, and they were trying to faithfully render an understanding of God and of Jesus. And I would say that it's interesting that if you read the writings of people that we now think of as the church fathers, Jerome, Irenaeus, Arius, some of these guys viewed some of these writings as legitimate, and so what's really useful in reading apocryphal gospels, I think, is some copies of the apocryphal gospels will include footnotes of what the different church fathers wrote about those particular documents. And so then you don't just have your own discernment, but you have the discernment of 2,000 years, or well, in this maybe more like 1,000 years worth of intellectual debate about the veracity of each one of those writings. I think that's pretty, again, it appeals to my scientist in me, where it goes, okay, yeah, I don't necessarily know all the ways to discern whether this is truth, but at least I'm going to be informed of the other so-called experts and get their opinion too.
One last question on the whole Gnostic idea. You mentioned that there is one part of Gnosticism which does kind of denigrate the body as being just, kind of a false self. But there's also a different strand, which I find more appealing than that relies on the notion of true knowledge, so gnosis, knowledge.
Right.
Not just everyday knowledge of the true self. And this, of course, is where Gospel of Thomas and the Eastern, blend kind of comes together. And there's even some ideas that Christ actually went to India for a lot of his insights and came back, and that's kind of where his true teachings came from. Who knows if that's really the case? But does that resonate with you, the idea of gnosis as knowledge? And so you had your own experience where you saw the architect,
right,
the scaffolding. That's what it means to me. The gnosis.
You're amazing that you came up with that question and that connection, because I do. Let me close the door because I don't let in some insects. And I see more of a parallel to Gnosticism within Zoroastrianism than I do from beliefs coming out of India, because at the time the beliefs coming out of India would be Hindu or maybe proto-Buddhism, but probably not Buddhism. It would be Hindu beliefs in Zoroastrianism, which is the religion that was supreme in Persia at the time, the first monotheistic religion. There is a belief that there are two realities, the Minak and the Getik, that there is a surface reality and a deep reality. And I do not find that in conflict with, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. In fact, I would consider experientially that seems to me probably what is the reality of things, that there is a level of reality that we see and a level of reality that is behind it, deeper than it. And to me it's akin of, okay, if you were an ant, you would see a human foot, but you would not perceive it to be a human being. You'd perceive it to be a hill or a mountain. There's something bigger there, and I'm not sure why we think we are the only animal that sees it all. And so, whether it's exactly how the Persian Magi would have articulated or not, I do think that there's something there to think about and a truth from it. And I'd also say that that's not a anti-Christian or removed from Christianity or Judaism. There's a lot of evidence to indicate that there's an interplay between Judaism and Zoroastrianism, and that perhaps one informed the other, or vice versa. The Persian kings, after all, were the kings that freed the Israelites, right? And helped them rebuild the temple. And so there's a cultural blending. There was huge Jewish community in Persia. center from the Babylonian captivity on, Jews did not all go back to Israel. There was a large Jewish population all around the Eastern Roman world, and from Persia west to Italy. And so it's important to realize that, and it's written about in the New Testament, right? What's the part that we always remember at Christmas? The three wise men. But at least in most translations of the Bible, they are put down as magi. Magi weren't just wise men. They were priests of Zoroaster, right? They were Persian priests of what we would now think is a foreign religion, right? That were going to venerate or worship the baby Jesus. And so either that was a true event, right? And there's an interplay from those religions, or someone came up with that event and there was an interplay between those two religions. One way or another, there was an interplay. Why would someone write about it then, otherwise? So I do think that there is, that just because I might say that there are pitfalls in Gnosticism doesn't mean that there's something to be learned by it, or something that is found elsewhere in the monotheistic faiths. Zoroastrianism being one of them that really clearly has a similar belief. And that I think a lot of people experientially in our culture have come to perceive. I think maybe the literalism of our culture has caused people who question the literalism of our culture to search for that deeper reality.
Now, changing tacks a bit, coming up from the depths here. Christianity is pretty clearly the most influential faith that's ever existed on our planet. It's really not debatable.
Right.
Why?
I would say it doesn't make any sense at all, right? Like that Christianity is the most influential, despite the fact that it, at least in its beginning, was not a martial religion, right? That it did not spread because of conquering armies, right? And most of the other faiths of the world, besides Buddhism, have largely spread by conquering armies. Both Christianity and Buddhism partially spread by conquering armies, but mostly didn't. And it's also despite the fact that Christian religion was fundamentally antithetical to the ethic of the Roman world. Right? The ethic of the Roman world was really weird. It was a veneration of tradition. And the reason why Roman authorities let Judaistic practitioners off the hook for things like worshiping the emperor was because they could point to a long-standing tradition. And the reason why they didn't let Christians, once there became a differentiation between Jews and Christians, they didn't let Christians off the hook, was because they couldn't point to a long tradition. And so in the Roman world, Christianity was a scandalous form of atheism, right? If you look at the Roman documents of what punishments against Christians, they're being punished and being put to death for atheism, which is really, really interesting.
Ironic.
I mean, really ironic, really sad. I mean, the amount of human suffering that came from it. But, how does a faith that is looked down upon as like the lowest of the low in a civilization that is at its pinnacle, how does that faith take over that whole civilization? And then how does that faith even spread and be retained by cultures, even cultures that were taken advantage of by Christian cultures, right? So I think it's fair to say that no cultures have been hurt more by Western civilizations than Native Americans and African nations, right? Genocide, slavery, right? And colonialism. And yet, these cultures, even now, have taken Christianity and in many cases have even advanced, in some ways, I would say, Christianity, instead of rejecting it as part of the tools of colonial powers. Many other cultural icons have been rejected by the nations that were colonized, but Christianity is retained, if not even made a part of their identity. And I think that's why it makes no sense that Christianity is the most influential religion. If you think of the logic of man and the logic of power. But I think if you look at things at a deeper level of what reality is, maybe the spiritual reality, if we are going on the Persian differentiation between Manak and Getik, I think maybe the Christian version of that is, the foolishness of man is the wisdom of God, right? That there is a deeper reality and a deeper need than we have. And that even at a time in human history where military might really was the only important currency, military and economic might, that there is some need in humanity so much deeper than even that Christianity and the God that is revealed, Christianity, connected with people. That need in people, that resonance of truth was so powerful that people would rather die than even deny its existence, right? I mean, I would like to think that I'm a courageous person, but if I step back in those shoes, I probably would have remained a Christian, but I would have been one of those ones that would be like, because the Romans, it was very interesting, except for a couple of the persecutions, they didn't really want to execute people, right? They wanted to get people to acknowledge the emperor, right? And so they would let people off the hook if they repudiated their faith. Said, I'm not a Christian anymore, right? And it was so big of a deal that, of course, the church fathers write about what to do with people who repudiated the faith. And, of course, most of them said, well, we're going to take them back, right? So I probably would have been one of those. I mean, I have to look at honestly. I would have probably thought pragmatically and would have been like, God will understand that if I just, save my life right now, right? But there were a lot of people who made the other call, a lot of people. And then a lot of people who made that call inspired more people to join, right? I mean, how does dying painful deaths inspire you to go, oh, I'm going to do that, right? And so, there's various other theories about the spread of Christianity, right? Some people say it has a lot to do with episodes of plague. But regardless of how it spread in a way that no other human idea has spread. If you subscribe to the disease theory, it spread because Christians were the only people in urban areas that would not try to get away from the diseased, right? That would care for them. And that when inevitably some people that had caught those plagues didn't die, that of course they were more open to Christianity, right? I'm not sure that theory it has enough supportable evidence historically or not. But even if that material theory about the spread of Christianity is correct, it also reflects an aspect of Christian teaching that's very, very different. But I also would argue that Christianity would have been lost, ironically, without Islam. That really, all these writings, for instance, almost all of them would have been destroyed if it was not for Islam, right? So it's sort of a really weird thing, because it was an Islamic civilization that preserved most of the writings of all the church fathers, besides the Bible itself, right? And so we probably today already have an incomplete faith. We've lost a lot of, it's like, if we were trying to piece together particle physics, but having lost 50% of the information about particle physics. And now we're trying to piece together Christianity, having lost 50% or more of the information about Christianity. But we would have lost a lot more without the Islamic libraries and Islamic intellectuals that very much prized, obviously, these Christian writings instead of destroying them. And I find that to be a divine irony, right? Like, not an irony that makes me sad, an irony that goes, that there's this synergy that exists even when the infantile human aspect of these civilizations don't want it to exist, right? And I think that's really, really interesting.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm coughing. I'm gonna get some water real quick. Have you read Elaine Pagel's Beyond Belief?
No.
Have you heard about it?
If you recommend it, I'm there.
Yeah, it's really good. She basically talks about the early Christian development, and she discusses this era of persecution of the Christian faith and how that was in fact really key in it becoming such a powerful force, because people were drawn together because of persecution.
I think that makes imminent sense to me. But I also think that there is something it's sort of the I'd also think that there is something that happened in human consciousness, in what they call the axial age, right? That starting from the time of the Jewish prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, and ending in the advent of the Prophet Muhammad, is 1,000 years in which the human understanding of God went from the sophistication of Zeus, and the pantheon of Greek and Roman gods, and sort of just powerful, their version of gods are just powerful humans, right? With all the frailties, all the weaknesses, all the envies of humans, to something so much bigger. And so one has to wonder if this happened all over the globe, all within the space of 1,000 years, if there wasn't some need in the human condition that made people start believing in these faiths that offered something different. And so, maybe Zoroastrianism being the first of those faiths, Judaism and Zoroastrianism being the first of those faiths, and culminating in the advent of Buddhism and Islam, that human understanding of God totally changed, and people gravitated towards it, and whole communities in remote parts of the world changed their religion. And I think the only modern equivalent of that is the example of Hawaii. When people think of why Hawaiians are Christians, they usually think of missionaries and all that sort of stuff. It may explain why they're Christians, but not why they rejected their old gods. Within half a generation of Captain Cook arriving in the Hawaiian Islands, the Hawaiian chiefs and society formally abolished their gods before a single missionary stepped foot in the country. And it makes me wonder how and if there were, even in these remote communities, even without the force of the sword behind it, how these communities around the world just sort of decided to be Buddhist or decided to be Christian. And there was a time when communities would even debate, well, we're going to turn into Jews, Christians, or Muslims, and let's have a debate over which one we're going to be. But, I mean, that's sort of almost amusing to think about, but what's even more fundamental is that these communities were rejecting whatever the previous ideology or the previous religion was, and they were deciding that they wanted something else, and then they had to decide which one they wanted to have. But I think it also says something about the similarities of those religions and the similarities of the religions that came out of the Axial Age. They provide something for the human condition that previous polytheistic faiths did not have.
A big reality, perhaps. It's getting later, so I'm going to ask you one kind of last line of questioning, and I'll let you get back to your business here. Actually, two important ones. So I know you've been intrigued by Sufism, recently. You've got a tattoo. Would you mind showing the tattoo?
Yeah, absolutely.
So your wife. Well, go explain it. Rather than
Well,
me.
this is a symbol that's called a Sufi. But it's only half of it. My wife has the other half, and it's the human heart yearning for the divine. It's a heart with wings. Often in Islamic art, it's portrayed with a half with a crescent moon and star on the heart. And I guess this goes back to what I said about that I started on a path through the Christian church partially because that's what my cultural connection was. And maybe if I had grown up in a different country, that would have started off some way different. But, and I don't regret it, because I feel, I firmly believe that the Bible is true. I don't necessarily believe that human beings are perfect at transcribing truth, but I believe that the Bible is true. But I also think that it would be foolish for us in the pursuit of faith, especially when, literally if we look historically, we really have lost 50% of our information about Christianity. That it would be foolish to not be informed by the knowledge of other faiths, particularly sister faiths. To me, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, especially once you get past the surface, are 99% the same belief. And I would say that's even a deeper connection when you get in the mystical traditions within each one of those faiths. And I've always been attracted to that because mystics search for the deeper reality behind things. That, I think, is something we really have to do if we're going to understand our world and understand each other. It's almost as if, Jalaluddin Rumi and the Apostle John and Thomas Merton and some of the Kabbalists are more alike than some of the fundamentalists in their own religion. And I think that's important to think about. The Sufism, to me, has an enormous amount of truth. So to me, if the greatest truth of Christianity is that, like the pangs of a woman in labor, that redeeming the world at some level requires so much sacrifice that even God, even a shard of God, had to be sacrificed in order to redeem the world, and that all of us have to at some level emulate that self-sacrifice. That to me is the most important core message of Christianity. To me, the most core message of the Sufi tradition is the oneness of God, right? And this is why many Muslims found the idea of the Trinity so scandalous. Right? They believe so strongly in the oneness of God, including our connection with the oneness of God. And the Sufi tries through disciplines to have that connection. And part of that is to break down the self and the ego. And their shocking term for this process is called fana, annihilation, the process of annihilating the self to become one with God. To become the drop that became the ocean, And I find that to be powerful. And I think the reason why I find it to be powerful is because when human beings are together in one search, there is a true resonance. I think people, who have been to a large Catholic mass, or even to maybe even a concert or a rally, can understand the swell that happens from mass consciousness, from people sort of at least mostly going the same direction at once. And while I think this process of fana is often something done in small groups or even alone, maybe under the guidance of a teacher, that it's part of a becoming part of the whole, right? Becoming annihilated into God, or and if obviously there's a lot of people being annihilated into God, that's definitely becoming part of that larger whole. And I think that I guess both that I view that that's an important idea, especially for people in our cultural understanding, our civilization. I think that that both the self-sacrifice of Christianity and the desire to break down into the whole and the connection with God of Sufism both have something uniquely important for people that grow up in a culture where the self is so important. And, what do people grow up talking about? Well, I've found my identity, right? Sort of like my search for identity is our ritual of manhood or womanhood, right? It is I guess I would think that anthropologists 10,000, 20,000 years from now will look at our time and I'll go, that's the defining element of this civilization, right? This search for the self and this valuation of the self. And I just think that that's not the most important thing. That we should search to know ourselves, because I think that's valuable, but that even more than knowing ourselves, we should sacrifice for the whole. We should try to break down that self into the whole, and to search for God. And I think that often still leads to finding yourself, right? But it's not an activity that's constantly enamored of the self. I remember in college talking to somebody, and I said, don't you want to do good things in the world? Right? And the person said, yeah, but I feel like I have to find myself first. And I feel like there are legions of idealistic people that will spend a lifetime finding themselves instead of serving and sacrificing and working, all which are forms of worship in my estimation, that would lead them to find themselves.
You have lived a life of service in many ways. You've held elected office for many years. How does your spiritual foundation influence how you govern, or not govern, how you make policy?
Well, I think that that's really important, albeit potentially scandalous in and of itself. I think that people in some ways want an elected official that is just trying to do what the majority of people want. And that's definitely not what I'm interested in, you know, and that might be a little scandalous. But I believe that there is an articulation in the faiths of the book. Again, I would call that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, though I would also say that those all are informed by or mirrored by some other faiths too. There is a articulation of what society should look like in those that I think Jesus refers to often by saying the kingdom of heaven, you know, with such things, saying things, for such is the kingdom of heaven. That to me is, as a, I guess, a post-millennialist, that is what the second coming really is, right? It's not a guy on a white horse coming down from heaven. It is the activities of God and the activities of people that are working for the purposes of God. And I would say sometimes the activities of people who don't even believe in God but may have the Word of God inscribed on their hearts, to create a world that resembles that. And a world of justice, a world where the least are given a place, if not first, right? A world where the ideals articulated in these faiths are reality. I think they starts when you hear about the writings of the prophets, you know, the justice for the poor, the widows, the orphans, and what's usually omitted but is all over the scriptures, the alien, right? The foreigner, the non-citizen, the ideals of jubilee and of love and living in one community. And I feel like it hasn't been lost. I mean, some of the greatest writers of our time write things that seem to echo that reality. That same poem I was referring to, T.S. Eliot's, one of the lines that really resonates with me later on in the poem is this: when the stranger returns, and he capitalizes stranger to seem to like signify Christ. When the stranger returns and asks, why do you live huddled close together in large cities, essentially? He doesn't see cities in the poem, but why do you live so huddled so close together? Is it because you love one another? What will you answer? We live close together to make money from each other, or because this is a community. And I'm searching for that community. I think that we build that community, we build that kingdom of heaven, and or we neglect it. And I hope that we build it.